This meeting is being recorded.
Aloha, my name is Julie Mitchell, and I am the Executive Director here at Ikahi Mediation Center. Happy winter solstice. Today is the longest night and the shortest day of the year. I believe it's somewhere around 5:30 Hawaii time. And you are attending on this day our Finding Solutions Growing Peace Brown Bag Lunch series. Some of you have heard me say this before, so thank you for your patience. Ikahi is a nonprofit community mediation center serving East Hawaii. We are one of 5 community mediation centers in the state. We were founded back in 1983, so it's our 40th year birthday this year. And we were founded originally as a program of the Island of Hawaii YMCA, and we became our own independent nonprofit back in 2006. Our mission is to empower people to come together, to talk and to listen, to explore options, and to find their own best solutions. To achieve this mission, we offer mediation, facilitation, and training, like today's brown bag, to strengthen the ability of diverse individuals and groups to resolve interpersonal conflicts and community issues. Our Brown Bag Lunch series is held every third Thursday at 12 noon on Zoom, and you just have to register each time to receive the Zoom link. I am always looking for new speakers and speaker ideas, so if you or anyone you know might be great, please shoot me an email or text or put a chat in the chat box of suggestions, because I am looking for new folks to speak for 2024. On January 18th is Dr. Anita Dorjak on the topic Resolving Conflict with Humor. Seriously, it's going to be great. I met her like I met Deanna. Well, I saw both of them at the American Bar Association Dispute Resolution Conference back in the spring in Vegas. So she gave a wonderful talk, and I highly recommend you come to her. I'm going to put the link and the topic in the chat if you want to register for that at some point. Also, I want to share my screen with you to talk about the next basic mediation training. I've been talking about this each time, and I realized I could have shared my screen this whole time. So we offer once a year basic mediation training. It is a 4-day training. It starts on Friday, February 23rd. It's a Friday, Saturday, and then a Friday and Saturday. It's a 4-day interactive training. It's perfect for anyone who wants to communicate more effectively, personally or professionally, become a better negotiator and problem solver, and increase your value in the workplace. And whether you want to enhance your communication skills or become a volunteer mediator at Ikahi, this training gives you the tools you need to start resolving conflict in peaceful, lasting ways. And I will put the link to check out that training a little bit more also in the chat. And I will say that this year we had some funding for this from the Rotary Club, which we really appreciate their support of this training. We were able to bring the price down a little bit because of that. So check it out. It's been invaluable in my life. I'll just say that. It's changed how I communicate at work, in personal relationships, and then also I'm able to help others by being a mediator for Ikahi Mediation Center. At the end of today's talk, we are going to ask you to fill out a short online survey, which helps with our grant funding for this free series. And I'll put the survey link in the chat. You just click into it to give us your thoughts. It just takes a few minutes. And we will also send an email later with the slides, the recording to the video link, and the survey link again, because sometimes people say they can't click in to the link on Zoom. So without further ado, please let me introduce our topic, Designing Eviction Mediation as a Tool for Violence Reduction. And our speaker, Deanna Parrish, serves as a lecturer on law at Harvard Law School, a clinical instructor at the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinic program, and the assistant director of the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program Negotiation Teaching Network. Wow, that was a mouthful. In these roles, she teaches and supervises graduate students in their coursework and clinical practice related to negotiation and dispute resolution. She is a certified mediator and active member of the District of Columbia Bar. I've had the pleasure of doing a webinar with her, as well as attending a conference session with her at the ABA Dispute Resolution Conference. So please take it away. Deanna and everyone, please give her a warm Zoom round of welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here with you all, especially as we're celebrating ikahi's 40th anniversary. Give me just a moment while I share my screen. How's that? Can everyone see that all right?
Mm-hmm. That is great. There's just a strange message that says rehearse with coach. Prepare your presentation. There we go. Went away.
Unfortunate that time has come and gone. So let's get into it. If at any point you have any issues seeing the screen or hearing me, please feel free to just directly unmute and let me know. So as Julie kindly mentioned, my name is Deanna Parrish. I use the she series pronouns. I work at Harvard Law School, and I also, in my capacity, both at the law school, but also on my own, do a lot of research specifically in the area of eviction diversion and how alternative dispute resolution methods and processes can be used to help reduce the housing crisis and promote housing stability. So just a little bit about the work that I've been doing over the past 2 years. I've kind of been possessed by this question of the ways in which multiple systems let down our most marginalized community members. And this is a question that for me was put into really high relief during the pandemic. I've been really lucky to work up close with housing advocates, community mediation programs, and court staff all across the United States that are all dedicated to increasing housing stability. And in 2021, the Harvard Dispute System Design Clinic, where I work, had the pleasure of taking on as one of its clients, the American Bar Association's task force on the legal needs arising from COVID-19. And so what that meant is that they asked us to conduct a nationwide research project on the best practices in designing an eviction diversion program. Our report ended up, no, I didn't, Robert. I did not attend the Harvard Mediation Intensive, but I've heard those programs are really wonderful. I was lucky enough to have this report picked up by the White House and featured as a best practice guide during a nationwide summit on eviction prevention. I also ended up publishing an article on in the Washington University Journal of Law and Policy, thinking about how eviction mediation programs specifically could be designed to achieve the goals of dispute system design, which is to deliver justice. So how do we think about power asymmetries and imbalances at the table in this specific case type? My most recent work on this actually was just published less than a week ago. For the last 2 years, I've been doing research with a colleague at the Princeton Eviction Lab, and we wrote a media article that came out in The Guardian. And specifically, we were looking at incidents of violence, so homicides, suicides, deaths, arson, harassment, other forms of physical abuse that happen in and around and related to the eviction process. We tracked incidents of this kind that were associated specifically with the removal of tenants from their home. Now, I'm sharing this information not because you need to hear about my publications, but rather because a lot of what I'm talking about today will come actually from these 3 sources, and I'll send Julie them along in case you have any questions about sourcing or any of the statistics I share, etc. I'd also recommend that you check out the Princeton Eviction Lab website. They have a lot of data on there that's really, really interesting, and a lot of interesting interactive maps that you can use to understand what the housing crisis landscape looks like in your own backyard. The subject for today is really going to be focusing on the problem, which is, as I define it, where the issues of housing and public safety meet. We are and have been in a housing crisis. Much of what I'm going to share in this first portion of the presentation, you likely already know very well. So the housing crisis in the United States predates the current moment, and it predates COVID-19. Between the year 2000 and 2016, over 61 million eviction cases were filed in the US, which averages about 3.6 million evictions annually. In 2016, 7 evictions were filed every minute. And on average, these eviction judgments for non-payment of rent are usually no more than 1 or 2 months' rent and involve less than $600 in rental debt. And I think it's notable that we share that eviction disproportionately affects Black and Latinx households, with specifically Black and Latinx women facing higher rates of eviction than men in those same communities. And this data doesn't even capture the informal or illegal evictions, which are estimated to occur at double the rate of legal filings that I'm sharing here. Also, over the last several decades, and especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, rents have steadily increased while wages have remained stagnant. So what this means is that there's a growing share of renters, especially low-income renters, that are rent burdened. So what that means is they pay somewhere between 30 and 50% of their income to rent. In 2019, 4 in every 5 renter households that were making below $30,000 in income were considered to be rent burdened. So we are and we have been in a housing crisis. And the COVID-19 pandemic didn't do much to help us with that. So the COVID-19 pandemic led to job loss, increased unemployment, severe economic hardship, all of which threatened housing stability. It raised the stakes for renters and property owners alike. The heightened rates of unprecedented unemployment, severe economic hardship, and job loss were found among Black and Latinx renters. And during the pandemic, American rents increased at the fastest rate they have ever increased in recorded history. So if housing is feeling particularly burdensome right now, that's because it is. And so we know that we're in a crisis. COVID accelerated that crisis. We also know that eviction harms tenants' financial, emotional, and physical well-being. So I'm sure you've heard this before. Evictions are commonly referred to as Scarlet E, so kind of like the scarlet letter. Even cases that are settled through mediation or through other means become public record, because the filing against a tenant is what goes on their record. And the filing against a tenant can impact a tenant in terms of whether and where they can rent in the future, whether they can qualify for a loan, for example, because all of this information becomes publicly searchable. And a lot of landlords, as well as banks and other large institutions, rely on these public searches when they're assessing the quote unquote quality of a future tenant or borrower. Typically, evidence of a filing against a tenant stays on that tenant's record for a minimum of 7 years. And it's depending on the jurisdiction, it can be quite burdensome to expunge the tenant's record of that eviction filing. So in this way, an eviction filing can follow a tenant for a very large portion of their lives. As you can imagine, sometimes these filings stack on one another, and so at every point, the finish line moves back. Eviction is not just associated with financial challenge, it's also associated with a host of negative repercussions for physical, emotional, and mental health. So as rents rise, families cut back on other spending, including on their essentials for their health and well-being. So for example, low-income households with children who are moderately rent burdened, meaning they spend somewhere between 30 and 50% of their income on rent, they tend to spend 57% less on healthcare and 17% less on food compared to unburdened households. What that means is when your rent goes up, not only do you have less to spend on food and healthcare, you also choose to spend less on food and healthcare. And at least in part, right, households are prioritizing paying rent over other essential spending out of fear that non-payment of rent could lead to an eviction, right, which in turn can lead to a bunch of other factors, or a bunch of other outcomes, excuse me. So in turn, eviction is associated with a host of negative repercussions for physical and mental health. And in fact, some studies show that the more rent burdened you are also associated with significantly higher levels of death. So there's an article about the Scarlet E in the New York Times. And from the Princeton Eviction Lab, higher levels of rent burden are associated with significantly higher levels of death. Finally, we know that there's a housing crisis. We know it was accelerated by COVID. We know that we know that eviction can lead to and precipitate, or is correlated with, I should say, all of these negative outcomes for your physical, financial, and mental well-being. But also the process of removal itself, the process of the eviction, which I know my mediators in attendance might care about the process as much as I do. The process itself can be quite dangerous and even lethal for many involved. And that's something that my colleague Juan Pablo Garnham and I have been studying over the last few years. So as you all know, every jurisdiction has its own rules for evicting a tenant. So that can be kind of hard to get into in kind of minute detail, but they generally follow a pattern. And I'd love to just share a little bit about that pattern here, so we're kind of oriented together. First, usually a landlord provides some sort of written warning that the tenant is in violation of the lease. Some states require landlords to provide tenants with a few days' notice before filing, while many others require no notice at all. After there's some sort of warning or notice, if it's required, the tenant usually has a specific number of days to either pay the rent due or move out voluntarily. Now, this range can really vary. Some jurisdictions, it's as short as 2 or 3 days, and some jurisdictions, it's as generous as 2 weeks. If a tenant moves out without paying their rent first, a landlord can still sue for any amount of rent owed. After that period, let's say that the landlord has filed, a landlord will file an eviction in court, at which time a judge will review the case, and either, if it's a jurisdiction where post-filing mediation is permitted, or even if there's buy-in, the judge will refer the case to mediation. Or if it's a jurisdiction where there aren't those services available, or a judge chooses not to engage them, then the judge may issue a ruling. The final step, whether a judge has issued a ruling, or if there is just non-payment of rent even after an agreement has been settled on by the parties, the final step is the physical removal of the tenant and their belongings from the property by local law enforcement. Usually it's no more than 10 days after the judge's ruling. In states with few or no notice requirements, a landlord can forcibly remove a tenant from a unit in as little as a few weeks from first giving them the initial warning. So the work that I have been focusing on really looks at the repercussions of this last step when law enforcement, but you'll hear later on, I promise the whole thing isn't quite this depressing, is that the further upstream we can intervene, right, the less reliant we are on these forcible measures, and the more we can rely on the peacekeeping measures, community-led measures, the work that you all are doing to help connect people with the resources that they need and bring them into right relationship with, or bring into right relationship with landlords and tenants. So I did do just a little bit of research about what this process would look like in Hawaii. And on average, it seems that it would take anywhere between 4 weeks and 8 weeks for a complete eviction process in the state. So there's an official notice required. There's a serving of summons and complaint. There's a filing of appearance. Then there's the court hearing and judgment. If there is no mediation, then there can be writ of possession and then return of rental unit. So you'll see that even though Hawaii seems to have a bit more generosity on the front end in terms of a few weeks on the upstream portion, further downstream, the process can happen very, very quickly. And I've got 2 colleagues at different institutions, Noam Ebner and Deb Eisenberg, who have described the eviction process in courts as a state-sanctioned way for landlords to collect on rent. So what is meant by that is that it's quite expedient, very quick in a lot of different jurisdictions. All right, so we know that we're in a housing crisis. COVID made it even tougher. We know that, oh, thanks for sharing that, Julie. We know that eviction as a whole can have negative impacts on tenants. We know that the removal process is where we're kind of focused in on in terms of the most dangerous of these outcomes. And then finally, the process of this removal can be dangerous and even lethal for many involved. So every jurisdiction has its own rules for evicting a tenant, as we just mentioned. It follows a pattern, but since 2021, Juan Pablo Garnham and I have been tracking news reports of such cases because there's no national database. So we've just been doing this by literally reading all the news we can. And since 2021, there have been over 80 deaths associated with tenant removals, including 30 alone this year. And I should say that that 30 actually represents sometime at the midsummer point. Other forms of violence can and do happen several times a month associated with the removal of individuals from their homes. This includes physical altercations between tenants and landlords. This can include incidents of violence involving law enforcement, even cases of arson. And I should mention that stakeholders across the table are at risk here. We've, of course, had tenants suffer injury and death, but we've also seen constables, sheriffs, be victims of violence, and in some cases, even landlords if they are present. And though my research has kind of stopped short of investigating the circumstances of each incident, in aggregate, I believe that these events tell us kind of a systemic story about the physical, emotional, and economic toll that eviction takes on everyone involved. So that's the landscape. Things are tough and the stakes are really high. And I believe that one solution here are eviction diversion or prevention programs. I think that systemic injustices require systemic solutions. For a long time, mediators, tenant advocates, and the like have long imagined interventions known as eviction diversion programs that could help diminish the possibility of the possibility and stress of losing a home. They can reduce violent outcomes and ultimately increase overall housing stability. So for the next little bit, I'd love to share a little bit about eviction diversion programs and the promise I think they hold to help circumvent and prevent and manage some of these violent outcomes that we're seeing. So if you've never heard of eviction diversion, you're in good company. It's any program that aims to prevent evictions from reaching the courts or diverts cases away from formal legal proceedings in the hopes of reducing harm and increasing housing stability. That means that these programs can look a lot of different ways. In fact, they might use legal representation, they might offer mediation services, they might offer rental assistance, financial counseling, social or housing services. They tend to combine a holistic set of services that help tenants at risk of a court judgment and a forcible move out get them the services and help they need in order to prevent an eviction or an eviction filing. And a study by the clinic where I work, we found that over 64% respondents of our to our survey, which I should say the respondents were eviction diversion programs, 64% of them offered parties either pre or post filing mediation. So mediation at some point in the eviction process became the most common approach among the programs that we surveyed. So I think that's quite something. And it's also worth noting that a lot of eviction diversion programs have taken their inspiration from the foreclosure mediation programs during the Great Recession, many of which kind of took shape in 2008. So if you've been mediating for a little bit, you might have even mediated some foreclosure cases in the past. And the goal of eviction diversion programs isn't just getting to a settlement, but it's also about keeping people safely and stably housed. It really bridges that kind of individual conflict perspective that we often see in mediation and looks at it at a more systemic level, because when we see so many of the same type of case, we have to think about how can we, in aggregate, help move the needle on housing stability. So you saw my little graph earlier around the process in general terms of an eviction, but I also want to share the different places where an eviction diversion program might intersect in this process. So eviction diversion efforts can happen at any point in the process. What we found is that the further upstream a tenant is connected with resources, whether that is a mediator, whether that's cash or rental assistance, medical support, or even legal counsel, the more successful that intervention tends to be in terms of contributing to housing stability. And I would venture a guess that, the further away we are from the forcible removal, the safer that all parties involved tend to be. Eviction diversion programs, though they may be new to you, they are actually not a new concept, but they definitely grew in popularity after the COVID-19 pandemic. So referring back to that survey that my students and I did a few years ago, 87% of eviction diversion programs that we surveyed shared that the use of interventions increased during the COVID-19 pandemic, meaning these programs, and especially mediation, was used a lot more during the COVID-19 pandemic than it was before. At least 26 eviction mediation programs are currently operational. Of those, at least 15 were established in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, this is likely because there was this sense that there was something called an eviction tsunami coming our way. Because there was a federal moratorium on rent, there was also, or on eviction rather, and there was also state and local moratoria on evictions. Once those moratoria were lifted, there was a lot of fear that there would be a tsunami or a glut, a sharp increase in the eviction that we saw. And so a lot of mediation programs opened up to help curb that reality. Only 3 programs that I've been able to find, one in Maine, one in Michigan, and one in Minnesota, are known to have been formally established prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a eviction mediation program that stands alone, that lasts, that it was established prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. Certainly not true. We know of lots that existed before. What I'm referring to is programs that were specifically designed with that kind of holistic set of services in mind. So if you'll recall, right, does it have 2 or more of these services that work in close coordination to help support tenants with the explicit purpose of increasing housing stability? Okay. In our research, we engaged with eviction diversion programs across the mainland US, and now I'm very grateful to be here with you all in Hawaii. The eviction diversion programs we engaged include some that you might know well, including the programs out of Washington State, Philadelphia, Kalamazoo, Michigan, and Boston. But since the time of my research in 2021, there was even more money added to local and state budgets for eviction diversion programs. However, so more programs have been built, but also some have closed down because the end of emergency rental assistance meant that some of these programs have been disbanded. So it's hard to know exactly how many are operational at this moment. So they exist, they have existed, and they definitely boomed during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's also true that research shows that there's support for eviction diversion programs. Most landlords have no experience with mediation, at least those that we interviewed and surveyed. However, a majority of those that we surveyed agreed that it would be, quote, more efficient to mediate a housing dispute with a tenant than going to court. Going to court is often associated with a lot of time and a lot of money that landlords understandably don't want to spend. Despite this lack of familiarity with mediation as a process, over 73% of the landlords that we surveyed were more inclined to resolve housing disputes with tenants outside of court than in court. Now, this was a pretty surprising statistic for us and a really encouraging one, meaning that landlords would be open to a process that wasn't the same one that was resulting in the violence and harms that we saw described earlier in this presentation. So upstream eviction diversion programs we've found can help keep communities safe. And they may avoid some of the common political and administrative barriers that post-filing programs face. So what do I mean by that? Upstream programs are considered to be those around the time that a tenant fails to pay rent, and any time through when the landlord files an eviction claim with the court. And something that's really helpful about a pre-filing program is that they're more successful at connecting tenants with resources than downstream interventions. We get a tenant resourced sooner, they also can they also can avoid the Scarlet E effect, the eviction filing that goes on their record that's publicly searchable. We've also found that even though we don't have longitudinal studies to track this, you can assume, right, that the further away from the physical removal from their apartment that a tenant is, the safer they are as well. So at a downstream intervention, the intervention of or the presence of the state to forcibly remove someone and potentially be in what we kind of call the danger zone of incidents of violence increases. Whereas when we're at the pre-filing level, right, the state is not yet involved, constables, sheriffs, and law enforcement are not yet involved. So if we're able to connect people to resources sooner, they tend to be able to exist more safely, both in their existing home or move out more safely if need be. And so eviction diversion programs, court administrators and landlords alike actually all tend to prefer upstream interventions to downstream interventions. And this is really interesting. Both tenants and landlords agreed to this. Among eviction diversion program respondents, so the programs themselves, over 70% preferred pre-filing interventions. And this jumped to over 90% when we included post-filing but pre-hearing, meaning that there is something that's been filed against the tenant, but they haven't yet gone to court and sat in front of the judge. Also, interestingly, among landlord respondents, 46% of landlords prefer pre-filing interventions, but similarly, it jumps up to 71% when including a post-filing but pre-hearing window. So that's really interesting, right? Generally speaking, upstream interventions we know will keep people safer, but also have pretty wide support among relevant stakeholders to these kinds of disputes. It is worth noting, of course, that landlords are relatively less agreeable to pre-filing solutions, right? Only 46% as opposed to 71%, but still 46% in my estimation is significant. And then finally, post-filing solutions require buy-in from judges or political entities to help shape state legislation, court rules, et cetera, that would either require or incentivize eviction diversion programs. So what do I mean by this? It's kind of like picking whose buy-in you need. At the pre-filing stage, you need to incentivize or get buy-in from landlords because you don't have the judge's thumb on the scale, so to speak, to mandate some sort of pre-filing process, whether that be mediation, whether that be financial counseling, whatever it is. Once you have filed, if you have buy-in then from judges, you might be able to mandate it. But in order to get that buy-in, there might be the requirement of changing court rules, changing county rules, even state legislation. So it can really vary. And when you're designing an eviction diversion program, a really important thing is to understand what is the landscape of allies I have in helping me operationalize and administer something like this. So in addition to the concerns and motives around safety, public health, that we might have for our tenants and landlords alike, we might also want to think about where would this program operate from, who would fund it, right, and whose buy-in would I need in order to make it happen. So I've actually been doing a lot of thinking on those last few questions, and I have one kind of wild idea that I've been playing with. In this, I was actually on the phone with a landlords association recently, and they told me we really want to do an eviction diversion program, but we just don't know how, and we don't want to run it ourselves. We don't think that feels, necessarily fair, or maybe we might not be seen as trustworthy. But we think it would be a great thing for the tenants as well as our landlords, and there is interest in it. But how do we make it happen? And so this tends to be a question of who will house the eviction diversion program, who will be the coordinator or the administrative body. For some jurisdictions, it's a program that sits within the court. For some jurisdictions, it's a community mediation organization. For some jurisdictions, it's run out of legal aid if there's, a support from legal aid for this kind of intervention. So it can really, really vary. But I was thinking about the data that Juan Pablo and I have found around violence and incidents of death, and really realizing that this is also a public health issue, because keeping people safely housed has long been kind of recast as a public health concern. And it then makes good sense to me that eviction diversion might also, oh no, Kenny just told me they lost my audio. Can you Can someone message or come on mute and tell me, did they also lose my audio?
Yeah, I have your audio.
You
I
have my
have your audio.
Okay, great. Kenny, unfortunately, I think it might
I
just
have
be.
your audio also.
Thank you, everyone.
I have it.
appreciate it. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. So I'm sorry, Kenny. So all that to say, I can imagine a world where we might think about eviction diversion programs and mediators maybe working in concert with medical legal partnerships. Medical legal partnerships are an innovative form of dispute resolution and service provision, especially for low-income folks who are either seeking out medical support or legal counsel, where a low-cost or free medical provider, thank you, Dr. Kat, and a low-cost or free legal aid provider work in concert to make sure that their patients/clients are getting the needs that that they have met. I could imagine a world where there are mediators, social workers, court navigators, whoever it may be, who are working as a part of this in an effort towards reducing the public health burden and cost of violence that's inherent to, and we've seen proven to be a byproduct of the eviction process. So that's a twinkle in my eye, someplace I've been thinking of, something I've been thinking about. The last thing I'll share is if and when this gets built in a medical legal partnership or elsewhere, the research I did for the ABA resulted in a couple considerations that I would suggest any program consider or take into account when they are designing their own program. It's the who, what, when, and how of eviction diversion. When you're designing it, I encourage people to think about who will be involved in the design, implementation, and support of the program. What services or resources or processes should the program include? Should it just be mediation? Should it be other forms of dispute resolution? What would be culturally competent for the community that you're serving, for example? When, so at what point in the eviction process will the intervention take place? Will it be an upstream intervention? Will it be a downstream intervention? What are the costs associated, financial or otherwise, in either choice? And then finally, how will this eviction diversion program center its users? So that's a key feature of any dispute system design, is making sure that the users of the system are involved in the design of that system. So if the users are tenants and landlords, how can we involve them in the design of this program? Before I open it up to questions, I'll just end with a quote from one of our interviewees that says, "Housing is a human right. A successful diversion program is one that sees that homelessness as a violation of that human right. The question of whether a tenant stays or moves to another apartment is irrelevant as long as that tenant has access to another dwelling where they have rights. Success in this country is going to be the recognition of and implementation of laws and procedures that recognize that housing is a human right." And so until that's true, I'm really looking forward to thinking in community with you all about how peacekeeping, mediation, and other efforts and processes can be used to help us get there. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Deanna. We really appreciate your sharing. And I think I'll let people know, because they may not, or they may. We at the 5 nonprofit community mediation centers in Hawaii, we collectively hold a contract with our state judiciary. So part of that contract is providing free residential landlord-tenant mediations that are in district court, small claims court. So that is something we do, but it is post-filing. And once people are already facing eviction, it may be related to being evicted or not. It may be related to back rent or damages or security deposit return. And then for those of you who are following what was happening in Hawaii during the COVID pandemic, as soon as it started, several of the mediation centers launched rapid response landlord-tenant mediation programs to try to address this and help people. We were able to get funding to provide free residential, at least on our island, we did free residential and commercial landlord-tenant mediations for about a year. And then there was the Act 57, which happened, which created for 1 year a free statewide landlord-tenant eviction mediation program that expired after 1 year. So here on Hawaii Island, we did manage to work with our county to have yet another year of free landlord-tenant mediations. However, we did not have the law behind us, which mandated that pre-filing, everybody had to come through landlord-tenant mediation. The other good thing about that time was there was so much emergency rental assistance programs, ERAP, that was a huge partnership in the program. And if someone was filing in court, they're like, did you do what you were supposed to do related to Act 57? No, go talk to the mediation centers. And then we worked with the rental assistance providers. Since then, in East Hawaii this year, we got more funds to continue to do free landlord-tenant mediation programs for everyone, because not everything's coming through court. However, without those laws, people don't have to participate. It's voluntary, which, most mediations are. And we are looking to potentially go back. We last legislative session, the 5 mediation centers, Hawaii Appleseed, and other providers of ERAP, we did go to the ledge and try to get another bill passed for a pilot program for an early eviction mediation program. We were not successful. We're hoping to try again this year, though a lot of the legislative energies are focused to helping Maui, and yet this could help on Maui. This could help on all the islands, because as we all know, the cost of housing is the highest in our state as any other state. Okay, so I just thank you for letting me share that, Deanna, and then I see Susan has her hand up.
Yeah, I've had, it seems like quite a different experience as an attorney representing, most of the time it ends up being the landlords. But I have found that the main problem is that the people that aren't paying their rent refuse to communicate. And the landlords have not been that evil with this. They've actually probably would have worked something out, but the tenant shuts down, locks the gate, won't allow anybody in. And the flip to that is a lot of these people were collecting rental assistance, but it went directly to the people. So they were making more money than they made pre-pandemic and not paying their rent. And then you have a landlord who has bought a property as part of their retirement, and they're going to lose it because they have a mortgage on it, and people are not paying rent for months. I've actually had one lady who is now in a care home, had a stroke, can't talk anymore. She'll never see her property again. And the tenant used every horrible thing, from appeals to disputing the ownership of the property through a son that wasn't even given the property when the father died. And she's lost it. They've just given up. They spent so much time. It's been almost 2 years. So saying that somebody is out in a matter of days or even months, my experience has been the judges are very kind, and I support that completely. I don't want to see anybody on the street, but by the time you post a 45-day notice, then you can't serve the people for 2 months because they hide out. Then you finally get a court date and they ask for a lawyer. So then it's another 30 days. It ends up being, I haven't seen an eviction get done in less than 6 months since I've been doing them. So I think they're starting things out prior to court for all parties would be such a great thing. If we could legislate something that says it's built into a lease that these people agree that they will meet at ikahi, as soon as they're noticed by, in any type of fashion, that they will agree to meet or by Zoom or whatever they want to do, and see if they can work something out. Because it is a horrible process for all the parties involved, has been my experience. So there's my 2 cents worth. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. Do I see Shayna's hand also?
Before we go to Shayna, do you mind if I just say something real quick? Thanks for sharing, Susan. I mean, one of the lessons that we really learned during when we had Act 57 and the rental assistant was some of the dynamics you're talking about. We noticed that there's a lot, especially in Hawaii Island, there's a lot of mom and pop landlords that really rely on the income. And also a lot of them are really kind. They didn't want to have to evict people that were long-time renters. And they were afraid to do anything wrong. So they were kind of paralyzed because they didn't want to do anything that would be illegal. And it was very confusing because new orders were coming out all the time. So one of the things the mediation centers did was act as a big clearinghouse of information. We probably had as many inquiries that we gave information as actual cases. And then for a lot of the tenants, what we noticed, both in foreclosure cases, we used to have a 4-year foreclosure mediation private pilot project on this island only, in this circuit only, and we had the landlord tenant program, is that when people get into debt, one of the things they do tend to do is put their head in the sand, and it's very hard for them to deal with it and want to communicate. However, they will talk to us because we're a nonprofit and we care about them. We care about everyone. The whole thing about mediation is that we're omnipartial. We care about everyone. And so we're not representing the landlord or the tenant. We're neutrals that are trying to see what people can work out. So I think that is a huge benefit, and why people will often talk to us when they don't want to talk to the landlord. And sometimes we would just talk to both parties, and then they would just talk directly and they didn't even need mediation.
Yeah, something I'll say is the timelines I shared are based on aggregate data from jurisdictions across the country. So not reflective of your specific jurisdiction. Makes total sense. Yeah, something that I think is really powerful is that upstream interventions are supported kind of across the table. That's certainly, again, not indicative of every specific jurisdiction and every specific landlord or every specific tenant. It seems like there's a lot of promise to doing developing pre-filing interventions. It just then becomes this hot potato question of who's going to house it and who's going to fund it and who's going to administer it. Because if we want it to be a holistic, thanks, Paul. Have a good one. If it is going to be a holistic intervention, but we don't have a government entity or necessarily a community entity in every community to do so, then it becomes kind of a bit of a hot potato. The other thing I'll say is a lot, and I say this I write about this in a different article, is every eviction diversion program should be tailored to the community in which it sits. So I can imagine that, right, if you're saying, Julie, a lot of the landlords that you're working with are mom and pop landlords, that actually is a really different set of incentives and relationships than what we might think of as a quote unquote frequent flyer landlord. So, a landlord that I spoke to recently has 40,000 units, right? And will file kind of in bulk, right? There's really different relationships on the line. For example, I've seen mediation do such powerful things, especially for landlords and tenants who share units, right? Who share, not a unit, but share units in a building, right? Because that's a situation in which the relationship really does matter and is quite sensitive. So there's a human element to it. So all that to say, I think any of these programs should be tailored and responsive to, the communities in which they are going to be designed and used. And that takes into account housing stock, how new or old are the buildings, right? Who are our landlords, relationships between the parties, who's funding it, and the like. Shayna?
Right. Yeah. Hi. Trying to turn on my video. Sorry. Well, I had a property also before Hawaii in Colorado where you could you get standard first, last, and deposit. Here, it's first and deposit, no last. So I've had half the people move out without paying their last rent. And one woman didn't want to move. It cost me $3,000 to get her out. And I had to literally rent her a storage locker for 2 months make 6 pickup trucks from the house back to the storage locker. Hawaii is not tenant landlord friendly. And what Susan said was absolutely what my experience too. People don't pay their rent. What happens to me? I lose my property. It has to work both ways to support the landlords too. I charge below market value for my unit just so that people are happy to be here. And because I think that the rents are not proper, that they're over. So when I don't have a lot of leeway to have people run out and not pay the rent on me. And I'm going to lose my property because I got some tenant that refuses to pay, even when, you know, the dog and the cigarettes and the booze are way more important than paying their rent. So yeah, I think Hawaii is terrible as far as supporting landlords. That's it. I'm done.
Okay, does anyone else have any thoughts? I mean, I know there's some people on here who are mediators who definitely have mediated these types of cases or been involved in the Act 57 mediation. If anyone has anything they'd like to share about the impact of doing these types of mediations or things that you've seen, you know, we'd love to hear from you. Oh, I think Charlie, just unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm Charlie from Oregon. And I've done well over 800 mediations on landlord-tenant cases. And I'll have to agree with the 2 previous people. A lot of landlords are mom and pop operations. They really care for the people. Then people take advantage of them, from my observation. Where we have difficulties here is the real large organizations have thousands of apartments for rent. They're very non-humane in the way they handle renters. That's been my experience. So the more it is mom and pop, the more personal concern, it seems to me. And those people are often taken advantage of. And then the large organizations, the tenant normally is just a number. I'll share that with you. I don't know what the others think about that.
One thing I can share about our program when it was mandatory is I'll tell you our agreement rates were pretty high, you know, at that time with the landlord tenant program. A lot of it did have to do with those rental assistance. Oh, Kenny G, I see that you raised your hand.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I don't know if I heard it right, but I thought the speaker said something about once the eviction process was, it was part of the records where the cases where I've mediated, I was under the impression that unless the eviction goes through and is actually ordered by the court, that there's no record. I'm just looking for some clarification on that.
I would throw to you, Julie, because I'm not aware of the court rules or legislation in your state. But I'll say that in a state where there's no expungement or no record sealing, typically an eviction filing is all that's necessary in order for it to get on your record. But it may be different. There may be special laws in Hawaii that prevent that. Julie, do you know?
I'm not an attorney, so I don't want to speak about legal information that I don't have the facts on. I do know that Legal Aid did a lot of, they still have on their website a lot of material for landlord and tenant issues. And I do recall them talking about it going on people's records. And that was one of the advantages of doing mediation and trying to do something first and maybe leave on your own terms versus having eviction on your record. And a lot of the landlords, like we heard from some of these folks, like some of them were willing to just be like, you know what, I just want you out. I'm going to waive everything you owe me. I just need you out of the unit. And the person left and they got their place back. Yes, they were out some of the monies, but it was in some ways it was a win-win for both of them. The tenant got to leave without money owed. The landlord got their unit back. Other times they worked some private agreement out that allowed the person to stay, or they got a job, or they were going to pay backup makeup payment. So there's so many different solutions available. Mediation is as creative as the people who are there. There was people who decided to do work trades. They had skills. I can't pay rent because I don't have a job due to COVID, but I'm a carpenter. How about if I fix the unit up while I'm staying there? So there's so many different options that happen in these mediations that we really can't address all here. And most people, they want to resolve their issues. They don't like to have a lot of issues. And yes, there's some bad apples, landlords and tenants. There's definitely slumlords in Hawaii, and there definitely are people who are not leaving and trashing a place before they leave it. And there's a lot of other folks who would sit down and be able to work things out. So I, support our program that we have currently, and I hope we can get an early eviction mediation diversion program going here. And I'd like to thank Deanna for being our speaker here today. I'd like to thank all of you for spending time with us today. I've put in the chat box a couple times the survey for our program so that you can give us your feedback. I am definitely looking for new speakers. And so if you know anyone, you can make a note in that survey of ideas for speakers or topics. And please check your email. I will send out the slides that Deanna shared, the video link, and I'll put the survey link again in case the link in the chat doesn't work for you. And just please join me in giving a very great round of Zoom appreciation for Deanna, our speaker, who's spending time with us on her vacation. It's her last thing she's doing before she's officially done with work for the year. Thank you, Deanna.